Okay, so good morning. My name is Danny McKendry. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Principal Landscape Architect at Architecture and Design Scotland. And we are, if you don't know, some of you will do, but we are Scotland's design champions, or an agency of government. And we're here to try and promote the value of good architecture and sustainable design to people's everyday lives. So not necessarily anything fancy, but really what matters. And what I want to talk to you about today is what I consider to be how the design process can help people work out what their priorities are and ensure that those priorities are delivered in the investments and decisions that they're making. We do this through promotion, learning and advice in a kind of virtuous circle. And it's interesting, I think, if you look at the slide that's there just now, to consider the situation we're in just now. So at the beginning of the year, I would say our priorities were around two big moves, big issues: climate change and the demographic reality of Northern Europe, an ageing population, but the requirement to still deliver things on the ground in a framework of inclusive growth, which is a priority of the government, albeit within very restricted public sector budgets. So they were the kind of drivers for all the things we're doing. And the inclusive growth includes that kind of accessibility, the kind of breaking down of the differences between opportunities for people across our society. Then, of course, came COVID-19. And whilst the other big considerations are still there, I think it has allowed us all to kind of consider our priorities in a new light, look at what has really been important for us, what has mattered and what hasn't. And there's been some chat about COVID being the earthquake and what's coming next to be the tsunami of trauma, transition and transformation. And I think an ability to consider what our place priorities are in the context of all of that is even more pointedly important than ever. In the past, over the few years, we have looked at what we've done both in the health world, but also in delivering housing master plans. It's been very clear to us that where we've been able to help and where there have been greater clarity and improvements has been around the topics of place, process and built environment, where we can help collaboration, facilitation of conversations and provide examples of good work. Place is really the consideration of what you're wanting to do, what's the vision for this project. The process is the kind of governance, the kind of priorities and the timeline of it. And the built environment, or the parts, is the hardware, the stuff, the streets, the landscape, the buildings, all the physical stuff that we need to do, even the digital infrastructure. That's important to consider at various different scales. At the place brief scale, the largest scale, aligning investments, and that ties in very much with the considerations around the place principle. At site brief scale, creating a community of people who are engaged and getting all of their requirements into that conversation. And also within planning and procurement, so that the skills and requirements and the must-haves are in there and are also deliverable within the planning system to allow the priorities to be achieved. Run a number of different workshops in different locations, and I'll touch upon those in a moment, around delivering those priorities. And the conversation where we look at place, parts and process usually boils it right down to finding out what the key tasks are going to be in terms of leadership, briefing, procurement, decision-making, policy, engagement, and the learning, and that kind of cyclical learning to check in, are we delivering what we said we wanted to deliver at the beginning? That kind of constant referral to where we were at the beginning, rather than just saying, this is the kind of place we want, or this is the kind of stuff we want, or this is the kind of process that's leading us. It's really, really important, and you'll see this in further conversations later on, that the places that look at the quality of the place, a proper consideration of the parts that are required, and have a strong process and governance and delivery process, are the ones that are successful. Quite often we see 2 out of the 3 of those, but we really need to have all 3 to work. And I'll touch upon that in the examples that come up. And part of this process, I talked about a learning process, and I've thought about this a little bit, and it's a little bit like writing a letter to your younger self. You see that in magazines, and people kind of say, what would I have done differently? So what's important there, and we've done this, some of the work, Heather's looked at this as well, this idea of, timelines, 30-year timelines. Where do you want to be? Where's your vision? What do you want this place to be like? And then working backwards, creating necessary steps and processes and policy to deliver that. This idea of knowing where you're getting to and then working backwards. It seems very obvious, but it's very seldomly done. So it's that kind of idea of embracing that. One of the big things that you'll hear a lot about, and many of you will be very familiar with this, is the place principle. And the government are, putting a lot into this. It's really about getting our act together, about moving from being disordered, confused individual groups working, rather to moving on to a collective impact. Quite often we see in the 3 stages there, disorder or individual impact, people working on doing their own things, or even a coordinated impact. Quite often the 3rd stage of coordinated impact is quite common. But the collective impact is really, really much, much stronger when there's a single goal, a single vision, and a single set of priorities that people have agreed on. It's quite important actually to personalise this as well, because quite often people are good at saying what other people should do within the concept of the place principle. But I think it's very, very important to think about what is my role in this as an individual, what are my set of skills. We all have general ideas of what's good, but being very clear in terms of your professional role and your skills role, how you can help. So that rather scary looking drawing of me there in the middle of the skills could be different for you, I'm sure, maybe quite similar, but be very clear of what your role is, what your skills, and where you can add to it, and where your organisation can do similar at the larger scale. In this conversation as well, I think it's very, very useful to consider the place standard tool. We've done a lot of work on that, and it is a very useful conversation tool, a conversation starter. It flushes out what the issues might be. It's interesting to use it as a thing through time. I know Inglesine mentioned in the past, considering it, what priorities in the past might have been, what they might be during the COVID period, and what they might be in the future, and viewed through the lens of place standards tool. And we think there's a lot of mileage in that. So it's really, really important, that idea of finding out what different people want. And that's just a snapshot, but also kind of sometimes seeing what the very strong differences that people might have and different viewpoints around a particular place at the same time. Another thing that we've been looking at as well, throwing this in the mix, is this idea of experiential type briefs and using personas as a way to focus in on that. Our biggest piece of work in that today has been the towns around town centre living in a caring place, particularly focused on elderly populations, about how, really considering in a lot of detail how people might be affected by decisions in terms of the layout of their town, their accessibility to services, etc., really changes their lives, and how that in turn should inform how services and places are developed in the future. We took this forward into Portobello. Originally, we were looking at new developments in Granton in Edinburgh waterfront, and we thought we'd then look at another sort of seafront place in Edinburgh conurbation and see if there's any learning there. Portobello is usually considered to be a good place to live, mixed housing, good community, a lot of access to various different things. But we held a town hall meeting there, and it was quite interesting to see how people perceive themselves. They saw themselves very much as Portobello as opposed to Edinburgh. They had a strong connection with the seafront and had lots of connections with each other. But as the conversation went on, we started looking more about their daily lives. It was quite interesting to consider that actually, in some ways, for them, they felt a calendar, an annual calendar about what a year in the life of that place was like would be more useful to them than a plan of just where things were. But even that wasn't a close enough grain. There was conversation around the daily life of a mum, 2 young kids. She used to walk along to old school along the frontage, have a good experience, meet people. It was something that framed her day. A really new, good quality school was built just inland a little bit. But now she has to cross 2 dual carriageways to get to it. So despite that built part being much better than the old school, the whole experience of the place and getting to it and her experience and the quality of her life was diminished, she felt. So there's that kind of whole thing about going right down to that daily life, looked into through the lens of different personas, either real ones or constructed ones. We've also used the idea of place, parts and process for infrastructure conversations. We were up in Lossiemouth recently, a very strange little conversation, which would become quite pointed really. The footbridge which connected the town of Lossiemouth to their east beach, which was their main tourist destination, had been basically neglected sort of disowned by everybody, had collapsed and then had become a crisis point. But there was an opportunity to discuss how to get the conversation about what was really needed in that place done. So rather than just jumping into design options, it was about what does this bridge mean for us? What does it, how can it serve the whole place? How can it be an economic driver? And what other investments can be aligned to improvements to this? It was very much seen as a just get the bridge fixed. Well, actually, there had to be a whole conversation around the processes that led to its decline. At the bigger scale as well, we've also looked at that, and in terms of process, it's really, really interesting. Blindwells have done a lot of work with East Lothian Council, and they're planning basically to consider a equivalent of a new town in East Lothian, built largely by private sector, but requiring necessary public sector investment in terms of transport, etc. We felt that actually they were very strong in all the parts, the stuff they needed to put into it, but less strong in terms of the overall vision for what this place was going to be, what its potential was. And also there wasn't the significant aligned internal governance to then give confidence in terms of external conversations with other big stakeholders. So in terms of the place principle, it's a really good case study of how to work that out. So we in the NDS provided them with some conversations around timelining this, but also about how to construct their internal conversations, the focus on the priorities that are required rather than being an isolation approach from different departments within the council. One little case study I wanted to share with you, and this is one that we didn't actually provide advice on, but rather we did a place standard sort of review of, is Fraser Avenue. 7N Architects led on that one in Inverkeithing. What's good about that is I think it probably does tick the box in terms of place, parts and process. Kingdom Housing Association and Fife Council worked very well here to basically deal with what had been a long-term problem, an area of very poor quality housing within Inverkeithing, which had become very ghettoised, a source of a great deal of antisocial behaviour and a lot of bad health as well. They showed great leadership. Their level of consultation was absolutely an exemplar, really finding out what people needed, especially people with special needs, people with various disabilities, etc., mental health issues, but also looking at how the place could be tied in and to the rest of the town. There's some very, very interesting things where, people are feeding back that children are playing here for the first time in a generation. Children are playing in the streets. They moved the shops from the centre of the ghetto area to the outskirts of it, but it provided then a new neighbourhood centre with other areas of housing closer to the town centre. So it changed the gravity of the place. So I think it's a really, really good piece to look at. I mean, it's quite significant change. The interesting thing there as well, about 85% of the people who are living in the old housing are now in the new housing. So the big thing they wanted to have was the retention of this community. These people want to stay here. The place is not inherently bad, but there are certain moves that need to be made to make it work. And I say, my opinion, that their masterstroke was moving the shops from the centre of the area that became into an area that served a greater area, and it provided a new health centre, better quality shops. And actually, some of the shops stayed on but improved themselves because they were in a better situation. So that engendered private investment as well. We've also looked at more rural areas. We were up in Orkney a few years ago, and we followed this up with conversation about rural housing. An interesting thing there was that they were very, very keen to look at design guides for housing. And when we looked at that, we thought, well, look, we've got a lot of guidance around that already. What you need to actually think about is what kind of places are you creating. The smaller islands are more about really survival, but the big mainland of Orkney was actually suffering what you might call suburbanisation. And we had a conversation about them saying, look, you need to have a process using some considered sort of core built elements to start to develop clusters of housing at various locations. The key thing was moving from the kind of just the people building in the corner of family fields into actually starting to align that perhaps around crossroad junctions, which actually are easier to serve in terms of the public sector, in terms of delivery of services, etc. And also having that higher hierarchy of the two bigger towns of Stromness and Kirkwall. This idea of creating a truly new Arcadian solution to this place There were clues in the past around how this should be delivered, but they'd been lost in the 60s and 70s with wealth, when people felt they could just build what they wanted because they had that ability. But now actually things are a wee bit tighter for them, and actually they're starting to damage one of their main resources, which is the landscape. They're starting to consider this properly. And I mentioned component parts. I mean, if you looked at one of these crossroads, for example, or a junction, there's lots of them, and this is a kind of a play on one of the little crossroads called Doomby in the mainland. But if you look at the idea of there'll be civic buildings, schools, terraces, gateway features, a park, etc. There's the idea of kind of using these elements in any of the kind of crossroads situations to kind of form a very high level design codification for that type of place, but actually recognizing that there are maybe 5 or 6 different types of development that you should consider, rather than all being going through almost a brochure for housing, but rather than saying what are the types of properties here, so that they're kind of, I suppose, values associated with each of those parts and what they would deliver, as opposed to what they actually just look like. And I suppose the key thing here is then setting up a process that allows that to happen, a process that allows long-term settlement change from small clusters around crossroads, but also setting up, that requires setting up rules around these hubs, the edges, the streets, the infill, so you've got active frontages, but also ensuring density and quality, which is a thing that we were kind of told when we first went up there, weren't part of the ordinary narrative. But actually, when you start to look at some of the remaining old settlements, there was a narrative of clustering to get out of the wind in terms of economies of scale of building and the service of the old larger estate farms. And some of those messages and codes and patterns, I think, are still relevant to successful development of local place plans, which is a conversation. What we tried to do with them is to say, get your thinking straight in terms of how you go through this, rather than tackling the detailed design of each building. Think about where you are, what's required in that place in terms of form, function, and fit. What's the capacity in that place? Where are you? Understanding there's a difference between the outer islands and the mainland islands, and then writing the guidance of how you deliver that for those places in terms of the component parts. So that looks at the context, it looks at the dynamics and the components as well, so that you've got quality in these places by design. So it's a bit of a flying visit there, but I've just tried to show the kind of process of thinking that we're trying to aid people with, to try and think early and clearly about what their key priorities are, so that they set in motion processes that almost ensure success, as opposed to ones which are purely reactive and might be successful, but more than likely will be troublesome for them. That's a bit of a blunderbuss approach to some of the things that we're working on just now. I make reference to the slide I put at the beginning, and this one is at the end as well. I don't know if anybody's read the book or seen the film How I Live Now, but I think it, strangely, is about a post-nuclear dystopia, and we're not quite there, but it's interesting, that conversation about how when things are utterly changed, you have to focus on what's really important. And if we don't have the thought processes and the design skills to do that, we're going to get a lot of messy non-solutions. So I guess this is about kind of thinking about, getting our thinking straight, getting our priorities straight, and working together to deliver those, and learning together as we do so. So that's all from me for just now, and I'm happy to take questions and have a wee chat.